While males are still the predominant characters in video games, recently the industry introduced a number of female characters as well. Lara Croft is the most famous of these, but there are others such as Rin and Joanna d'Arc. While more girls and women are playing video games, these new female characters were introduced to appeal to the main consumers, boys and men. And just as a very particular story about masculinity is told, characters such as Lara Croft also help to define femininity in a very specific way.
I think there's some really interesting contradictions operating in terms of how women are depicted in some of the most recent games. These contradictions have to do with the seeming empowerment of women, while at the same time we have a situation in which I think women are really being exploited in terms of how they're being shown graphically. You can see this, for example, with Lara Croft in Tomb Raider, where she is this highly energetic, muscular character, highly aggressive, and yet the video game presents her as this extremely, I would describe her as pneumatic, very busty, over-exaggerated sexual object.
I think that Lara Croft does challenge traditional roles of female game characters. She doesn't need rescue, for example, in her games. But she also is judged by the beauty standard, the same standard by which women and female game characters in video games have always been judged. For example, we can look at most female game characters' body proportions. They're grossly unnatural. Lara Croft has a large bust size and very small waist, and she weighs practically nothing. And yet, these characters can flip and jump and run in ways that anyone with that body proportion wouldn't be able to maneuver. And this body type doesn't even exist in the real world. We know this is true because the company that makes Lara Croft hires models to represent them at promotional events, and they have yet to be able to find a model that has Lara Croft's same body proportions. Not only do we have a beauty standard of the ideal female body that's impossible to achieve, there's also the sexualization of young women occurring in video games. And Lara Croft provides yet another example. In a recent release of Tomb Raider, The Last Revelation, game players can play Lara Croft as a 16-year-old, and yet her body proportions, the way that her body looks, is still that of a very developed adult woman. The connection between male fantasy in a video game and male fantasy in the real world becomes really apparent through the models that are hired to play Lara Croft at promotional events. At these events, male fans of the video game Tomb Raider and many other video games have the opportunity to have their picture taken with the real-life model who plays Lara Croft. So the fantasy of being with someone like Lara Croft becomes reality, at least for a brief moment, at these conferences, at these promotional events. And this is really disturbing, I think, because one of the models that was hired to play Lara Croft most recently is 16 years old. So the sexualization of a young female is happening in real life to a 16-year-old model who will be at these promotional events and have men putting their arms around her to have their pictures taken.
You know, a lot of what these games are about is sexual titillation for young boys. If you look at a game like Gauntlet, we have portrayed a Amazon goddess type, maybe a Valkyrie, very explicit in terms of her figure sexually, and with suggestions showing up in the advertisements for the games, you know, take her home, have her as your own, possess her, things like that.
We're not just seeing male fantasy and the sexualization of female characters in the video games. We're seeing it, perhaps even more so, in the advertising and the marketing for games and on the packaging for video games. Even if it's for a game that doesn't have any female characters in it. There's an ad for a racing car game called Destruction. Destruction doesn't have any female characters in it, but the ad for the game shows a woman leaning over the hood of a car. Another example is for Virtual Pool. Again, no female characters are in Virtual Pool, but we see in the ad that there's a woman leaning over a pool table showing us her cleavage. And this is a game that's a billiard simulation. There's an extreme example of this in an ad for Game Boy. In this Game Boy ad, you see a woman tied to a bed and she's wearing a lingerie. When we see female characters, most of those female characters are white. There are black characters in video games, but they play particular roles. So for example, in Kingpin, we see an unusually high amount of black female characters, but these characters are prostitutes, they're vagrants.